The movie is divided into 4 chapters. In the first chapter, Revelation, we are introduced to a woman named Elizabeth, who lives in the Midwest with her husband, Eli, and their 2 children. The first one is Matthew, who is Eli's son from a previous marriage. And then there is Sam, their recently born daughter. Elizabeth is a mute woman who communicates through sign language. She works as a midwife and is regarded to be excellent at delivering babies. A new preacher named Reverend arrives at the local church one day. He discusses the destructive nature of false prophets on society. When Elizabeth hears his voice, she becomes scared. She obviously had a past relationship with this man. Later, just before the family is set to depart, Abigail, a lady, unexpectedly goes into labor. Elizabeth escorts her into the church and assists with giving birth. Unfortunately, she realizes that the baby is abnormal, so it is impossible to take it out without harming the mother. This implies that one of them will have to go. Elizabeth secretly ends the baby's life after giving it much thought, hence saving Abigail's life. Eli comforts his wife upon arriving home, assuring her that the previous incident was not her fault. She says it was the Reverend's fault. However, Eli dismisses her claims as he believes the Reverend is a man of God. Later, Elizabeth heads to Abigail's house to check on her. Nathan, the woman's husband, interrupts her, stating that the Reverend has already made arrangements for them to see a doctor. That evening, he gets very inebriated and shows up with a gun outside Elizabeth's house. He shoots aimlessly, while shouting that she killed his son. Eli makes every effort to soothe him, but to no avail. Nathan is sent away by the Reverend when he eventually appears. When Elizabeth notices him, she desperately tells her husband to not let him in, but Eli does anyway. Then, as Elizabeth watches from the other room, the 2 guys engage in an odd conversation. Her look suggests that she is afraid of the man. Eli is informed by the Reverend that his wife sinned by choosing who would survive and who would die. He says that she will be punished for this. He then asks Elizabeth to come out, but she is too scared for that. Thus, the Reverend leaves, but not before promising to come back again. Elizabeth begs her husband to take them out of town as soon as he leaves. Eli agrees this time, since he recognizes the man's danger. In a few days, he says, they will visit his father's home. He will try to sell his sheep by then. Sadly, Matthew discovers a horrifying sight as he enters the barn the following morning. The sheep have all been brutally butchered. Eli believes Nathan is to blame, so he and Matthew seize Eli's pistols and head over to face him. Elizabeth, meantime, blindfolds her daughter, since she doesn't want the young child to see the gory scene. Then, as she enters the barn to tidy up the mess, the door is suddenly locked from the outside. When Elizabeth peeks through a hole, she is terrified to see the Reverend taking her daughter away. She cries out for assistance, but no one is there to hear her. She stumbles and falls while attempting to climb the door, passing out as a result. Elizabeth awakens to find Eli back inside and the door open. He reveals that he went to Nathan's residence, but learned that the couple had already moved to another city the previous night. This makes it impossible for Nathan to be the culprit. As the 2 are talking, Sam suddenly shows up, bringing relief to the parents. That night, while Elizabeth is tucking her daughter to bed, the latter asks her a very weird question. She asks if her mother is a horrible person. Elizabeth discovers after hearing this that the Reverend brainwashed her daughter. She thus resolves to kill him at his residence out of fury. In the middle of the night, she takes a knife, gets on her house, and crosses the desolate town. But all she sees on her daughter's bed when she gets home is her doll. However, we find out that the Reverend has compromised her home. Right now, he's skulking above a sleeping Sam. Eli suddenly wakes up from his slumber and discovers that his wife has vanished at the same moment. He decides to investigate after noticing something strange in the barn. When he looks around, Eli takes his shotgun and goes there, but the Reverend stabs him several times as soon as he opens the door. When Elizabeth returns, she finds her husband still alive, but his guts are protruding out of his stomach. He asks his son Matthew to drive the family to his grandfather's farm. As he draws his last breaths, the boy then takes out a gun and mercilessly murders his dad. Elizabeth discovers that the Reverend has set fire to their home at the same moment. Thus, she doesn't waste any time in taking her children and driving away from the scene. The second chapter of the movie, Exodus, begins as we see a 13-year-old girl named Joanna wandering through the deserts. Soon she passes out due to severe dehydration. A traveling Chinese family finds her later and takes her to the nearby town of Bismuth. After Joanna is nursed back to health, she is sold to the owner of a brothel named Frank. He appears to be a greedy and dangerous individual who can go to any lengths to please his customers. As the days pass, Joanna befriends one of the escorts named Sally, who takes good care of her. She explains the do's and don'ts of the place and always protects her from evil eyes. One day, a drunken patron shows interest in Joanna, but Sally talks him into staying the night. The man agrees, but only if Joanna promises to keep an eye on them. Later on in the love encounter, the man becomes more and more violent, even beating Sally. He then turns to Joanna, and this is when Sally makes the difficult decision to shoot him dead. As a result of her actions, she is publicly hanged the next day. After a few years, the environment changes and we can see that Joanna has matured into an adult. She is currently one of the brothel's most well-liked escorts. The majority of Joanna's time is spent with Elizabeth, her closest friend. They long to leave this miserable city. Elizabeth bites the tongue of a man who tries to bother her one day. Frank, however, feels deeply offended by this and punishes her by amputating her tongue. She becomes silent as a result and must now use sign language to communicate. Elizabeth is unfazed by this and continues to pursue her goal of leaving the city and leading a tranquil life. One day, the two friends go to a matchmaker, who mentions that a man named Eli is willing to marry Elizabeth. Through his first wife, he already has a son. Elizabeth promptly accepts the offer, and she asks Joanna to join her. The two friends then return to their room and start packing, but just as they are about to leave, a wealthy customer buys all the escorts for the night. He is none other than the evil Reverend. That night, despite having all the escorts to himself, he only calls Joanna to his room. He claims that he is beyond salvation, but he is here to save her. He asks Joanna to own him as she stands there shivering. He claims that she has been avoiding him for far too long and that it is now necessary for her to make apologies. He begins viciously attacking Joanna when she resists. Elizabeth rushes over to assist her friend after hearing the disturbance from the other room. Sadly, the Reverend kills her with a knife. He then tries the same thing on Joanna, but she gets the knife to slit his throat. She then transforms Elizabeth into herself, lights her corpse on fire, and leaves the scene. Joanna visits a doctor later to get her tongue amputated. When he hesitates, she does it herself. She then gets on a carriage and sets off for Eli's home, disguising herself as Elizabeth. The third chapter of the movie is Genesis, and it takes us to a few years earlier. The Reverend is revealed to be Joanna's father in an unexpected turn of events. He is a depraved and dishonorable man who frequently hits Anna, his wife. When Joanna finds blood on her clothes one day, she believes she is ill. Her mother, nevertheless, explains to her that this is rather typical for girls in her age range. The Reverend hears them talking and observes them from a distance to find out what's going on. It appears that he has grown strangely attracted to his own daughter. He gives her constant looks and even demands that she tidy him up. Anna informs him that this is immoral as soon as she sees it, but all he does in return is punish her more. Outside her barn one day, Joanna discovers two wounded men, John and Wolf. They look like the last of a group of survivors from a battle. Joanna covertly conceals them within her barn after observing their extreme need for assistance. She provides them food and medication to help them heal as well. She grows close to John over the course of the days, but Wolf merely makes fleeting attempts to flirt with her. Then John tells her that he is not friends with Wolf. When he recovers completely, the latter will actually kill him without hesitation. John therefore devises a scheme and murders the man while he is having a piss. The Reverend visits a blacksmith in the interim and creates a unique device to conceal his wife's mouth. He claims that this is her axe payback. Anna is ashamed by this because she can't even talk to anyone anymore. She unexpectedly does the unthinkable the next day at the church during one of the Reverend's BS lectures. The Reverend argues that she deserved it and doesn't feel sorry for her in spite of this. Now that Anna is out of the way, he tries to force his own daughter to marry her. He even puts the same metal instrument around her face. When she resists and screams for help, John arrives and confronts the Reverend. He tries to shoot him, but the latter easily counters and shoots him dead. After this, the Reverend drags his daughter and whips her for befriending a stranger. He even forces himself onto her. When he gets tired and falls asleep, Joanna runs away from the house. The final chapter of the movie is Retribution, and it begins after the first one ended. Joanna and her two children are riding through the snowy terrains, desperate to reach Eli's father's house. Unfortunately, the Reverend finds them along the way and murders Matthew. Joanna is devastated, but she must go on because she doesn't have time to grieve. When she eventually gets to her father-in-law's place, she goes over the whole story with him. When the old guy finds out that his son and grandson have passed away, he starts crying uncontrollably. He does, however, swear to protect young Sam. After a while, Joanna grabs her gun and decides to keep guard outside. She soon spots the Reverend in the dark and shoots at him, but he appears to be elusive. He tries to intimidate her by saying that he is going to turn Sam into a woman. He also says that she made a mistake by leaving her daughter alone. Hearing this, Joanna rushes inside the house, only to find her father-in-law dead. Terrified, she tries to escape with her daughter, but the evil Reverend captures them. The two are seen to be tied to different poles in the next scene. Sam is approached by the Reverend, who repeatedly lashes her while Joanna looks on in fear. He says he can do anything he wants since he is a guy beyond redemption. But just as he is about to do something horrible to the little girl, Joanna breaks her arms and sets herself free. She then grabs a lantern and throws it towards her father, setting him on fire. Now that he is incapacitated, Joanna kills him with a point-blank shot. A few months later, when the movie rewinds, we see the mother and daughter leading contented lives. At the residence of her late father-in-law, Joanna has established a sawmill. She has some family members assisting her in her business. Regretfully, Joanna finds herself in difficulty once more. This time, it's Nathan. He shows up one day with his soldiers and introduces himself as the new sheriff. Then he shows a poster of Elizabeth, who is reportedly wanted for the murder of Frank, the brother owner. After hearing this, Joanna comes to the realization that Elizabeth had killed Frank that fateful night before helping her. But she cannot defend herself because she has already assumed that woman's identity. After that, poor Joanna is detained and transported away on a ship. As she sails away, she notices Sam happily playing with one of her relatives. This provides her with some relief, as the Reverend is no longer around to torment her daughter. Joanna then takes one final look at Sam before committing the unthinkable. Several years later, we see that Sam has grown into a woman. She has a daughter of her own and runs the sawmill. Despite losing her mother at an early age, she says that she can still feel her around.